This Saturday, the border battle is back as Madison and Minnesota reunite as the top two teams in the Central Division. The Radicals and Windchill, both coming off huge home wins over Colorado, and now set to rekindle their rivalry at Seafoam Stadium in St. Paul. Opening pull slated for Saturday at 7 Eastern, 6 Central. Broadcast exclusively on WatchUFA.tv.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. I'm Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. Week 9 preview pod coming at you. We are in the final 5 weeks of the 2024 UFA regular season, and it is time to separate the contenders from the pretenders. We have no teams currently qualified for the playoffs, but that could change in short order with a slew of top teams in every division competing this weekend. Most notably, I feel like in the South Division with 6-0 Carolina, the only remaining unbeaten team in the league, squaring off against the 5-2 Atlanta Hustle. I have both teams ranked within the top 3 of my power rankings right now on the WatchUFA.com website if you want to check that out. But both the Hustle and the Flyers figure to be championship contenders as they push into the second half of their schedules. But also of note, the game of the week matchup flexed into the schedule in the middle part of this week. 5-2 Madison coming off of a big win against Colorado, squaring up against the division leading 5-1 Minnesota Windchill. These two teams met back on May 24th with the Windchill claiming a 21-17 win in Madison. The Radicals, though, really looking like a true fierce competitor within the Central Division. They have the league's leading defense, and they are going to be looking for revenge on the road. San Diego, Colorado, Indianapolis, and Chicago all will also have key matchups in their own divisions. Cameron, we're really now hitting the final stretch of the season schedule. What are kind of your thoughts, both heading into your matchup against the Union this weekend, as well as a broad overview of what's happening in the UFA in general?
Yeah, so as far as our game with the Union goes, I mean, this is a big one for us. It put us at 4-3. It essentially put us in a tie with Pittsburgh for that last playoff spot, though they do currently have the head-to-head advantage on us. But putting us above 500, and it would give us the season head-to-head locked up against Chicago, which is maybe even the more important part of what could happen this weekend. On the other hand, Chicago's kind of fighting for the same thing. They beat us. They have an opportunity to potentially go up into third place, depending on what happens with the Pittsburgh-Detroit game. It would give them a chance to get the head-to-head advantage on us. I mean, the Central's a melee. I mean, all five teams at the top, like essentially everyone but Detroit, has a chance. So every game becomes very crucial because there's not a lot of room for any team to really slip up. And as far as the schedule, I am really looking forward to this Carolina-Atlanta game, which I know we're going to spend some time on, probably more than anything else in the schedule. That one is, my eyes are going to be going straight to that one. As soon as my game's over, I'm probably going to head straight to the locker room, and they start 30 minutes after us. I'll probably try to catch the last quarter if I can before I even leave Chicago.
Well, let's just jump right into it then. Again, these are two of the top 3 teams in my power rankings. They are, I think, from anyone's viewing eyes, 2 of the top competitors in this league, given the amount of quality wins both the Flyers and the Hustle have at this point in the season. I mean, Carolina has claimed their 2 matchups in decisive fashion over Atlanta so far this season, while the Hustle, their only 2 losses are against the undefeated Flyers, and they've racked up wins against Colorado, New York, and just sort of slaughtered the rest of the competition that they face in the South Division. These are 2 teams that rank within the top 6, both offensively and defensively. Atlanta leads the league in fewest turnovers per game. The Flyers aren't that much further behind them. There's just so much interesting and I think elite kind of teamwork for both Carolina and Atlanta heading into this matchup.
Yeah, both teams are top 3 in the league too, in like the three, what I consider the 3 most important like percentages, I guess, which is huck percentage, hold percentage, and offensive line conversion. They're either 1, 2, or 3 in all 3 of those categories. The only one that completion percentage, you mentioned that the Flyers are a little bit worse off in the turnover department, but it's not that much worse. And I think the most exciting thing about this matchup for me is that this is the first one out of they've already met twice, with Atlanta losing both games on the road. But this is the first one where both teams are essentially at full strength. So we really get to see what happens when the top 20 for both teams go at each other. Of course, Atlanta maybe with a slight edge having it be at home. But this is, I think you could make an argument. I saw your power rankings that Atlanta was third. I think you could make a pretty strong argument that they could be the second team in that power rankings, just because they do have 2 losses, but they're both to the team that's number 1 in the power rankings, and they have really held strong against everyone else they've played. They've looked incredibly impressive, in particular in games like their New York game and their Colorado game. And they value the disc at a rate that isn't being matched by anyone else in the league right now. I think this is going to be one of those, with both teams being at full strength. I don't expect something like we saw in the first 2 matchups where Carolina was able to get pretty comfortable leads and in somewhere in the second or third quarter, and you kind of knew the game was out of reach. I think this one's going to come down to the last couple minutes where a team's really going to have to put their imprint on the game.
I mean, again, Carolina has won both previous matchups, but I agree with you. I think that Atlanta has a slight edge coming into this matchup, both emotionally from where they're at in this season, as well as the sort of momentum that they get from having their first full strength lineup against the Flyers. I know Carolina was down a couple of their starters in both of the previous matchups, but this is clearly the most full strength lineup we've seen from Atlanta this season. And given the way that they've been playing, even with missing parts, this could be a real championship level experience for the Flyers for the first time this season.
Yeah, and I think the absences that they had were just way more important to how their team functions than the absences that Carolina had. Like in their second matchup, they didn't have Brett Holzmeier, who I think I actually don't know if we've put the moniker on it, really. I think maybe we mentioned it, but I mean, he's a top 5 candidate for MVP in the league right now, if you ask me. And, they didn't have Christian Olsen and Matt Smith, and I think somebody else in their first game. I mean, when you're taking away 2 or 3 people from the O-line of Atlanta, it's not that they don't have capable guys that they can put in there, but this is one of the top offenses in the league. You could make an argument the top offense in the league. So, obviously, taking away anything from it is going to change the way it functions and the way that they're able to exploit defenses. So I think being at full strength, being at home, I do give them a slight edge just for that. But that being said, I mean, it is the slightest of slight edges. I wouldn't even go as far to, I'm saying maybe it's a 51% chance that Atlanta wins. Like that's about as far as I'm willing to go, because Carolina's looked as impressive this year as anyone. They really haven't actually played a close game yet, which is really strange considering how far we are into the season. You feel like some team usually kind of gets you and gets close. Probably the closest game for a while was the Austin one, but then they just kind of pulled away in the third and fourth quarter, and it didn't look so close anymore. So maybe this will be the first time Carolina's really tested into the fourth quarter, and that is something I'm looking forward to, seeing how they respond in that situation, because they haven't been there this year.
One of the things when I kind of overview this matchup at a top level is just the amount of starting line talent on both offenses. For Carolina, You've got Alan Laviolette in this return season after missing the entirety of the 2023 season. He looks phenomenal this year. Looks like one of the best strikers in the entire league. He's paired alongside Jacob Fairfax and Anders Jungst, who figure to be just kind of perennial all UFA candidates, if not MVP candidates in their own rights. Like, I forget who it was from Houston this past weekend was talking about, I think it was Matt Bennett, from the Havoc talking about how Fairfax deserved more credit for what he does year in, year out for the Flyers. And I'm somebody who's inclined to agree. You know, Evan Lepler asks us to put together a top 20, top 25 players heading into every season. And I'm somebody who's always trying to push Fairfax basically into the top 15, if not top 10 in the league, because of his versatility as a player and also just his consistency in production, coupled with his end of quarter abilities and the one-on-one sort of domination he has whenever he gets the opportunity. I feel like he's one of those players who we consistently underrate because he's on these perennially stacked lineups that Carolina rolls out, and yet all he does is go out there and execute. That doesn't even get into Terrence Mitchell, Elijah Long, the sort of improvements of Alexander Wilcox in his second season, becoming a really mainline thrower, which is exactly what the Flyers needed after they lost Matt Guccio-Hannes, Joe White, Liam Searles-Bowes, and a couple other their mainstay throwers from the 2023 season. Again, the Flyers are undefeated for a reason, and as good as their defense has been playing, and I do want to get to that in a second, I think it's because of this star-driven offense that they have, which just seems kind of impenetrable at times. And then you flip over to Atlanta, they're coming off a performance in which they just re-broke the record set a week prior by Pittsburgh for fewest turnovers in a regular season game. Thunderbirds committed 5. Hustle committed just 4 against the Houston last Friday. And you talked about Halsmeyer, but we can go another 6 players deep. I mean, Jeremy Langdon is having his best season since 2017 when he was kind of a dark horse MVP candidate for the then Jacksonville Cannons. Austin Taylor and Bobby Lay are playing as complementary as any two handler pairings in the league right now, and they just have infinite range and can kind of strike from anywhere on the field, which really activates this hustle offense. You mentioned Matt Smith, Christian Olsen, the grinder components where they can really rely on settle down possessions and get easy, lots of passes, conversions. There's just a dynamicness to the hustle and the Flyers that I don't think we'll really see in too many other matchups this season between two offenses.
Yeah. If there's one area where I think Carolina could potentially really break the game open, and I say this only because of how we saw it play out in the first couple games, though, as we noted, there were some absences. But Atlanta in both those games didn't put up a ton of resistance when they did turn the disc over. And, you know, the Flyers have cooled off a bit since those first couple games against Atlanta and how well they're converting on their D-line. But it was something that it does give me a little bit of pause. That being said, you know, Atlanta's coming off the best regular season, you know, offensive efficiency ever in terms of turnovers and tying the record overall, right? Because the record, it was 4 from the postseason game from New York last year. So that certainly bodes well for them. If they only give, you know, Carolina 4 turnovers throughout the game, then that kind of solves that problem for them. But we're going to need to see a lot of fight from them because I would imagine, obviously, the level of competition between Houston and Carolina is very different. I would imagine there will be a few more turnovers than 4. I really want to see Atlanta's O-line fighting to get the disc back and finding ways to, you know, keep Carolina like at or below 50% when they do get the disc. I think that's going to be like kind of the fulcrum point. That's going to be where we're going to see is how well they do getting the disc back when they do turn it over. That being said, I don't anticipate their O-line having. I'm going to just call my shot now. Their O-line's not going to have more than 6 turnovers the whole game.
Sorry, did you just say you don't think Carolina's going to have more than 6 turnovers all game?
No. Atlanta's O-line is not going to have more than 6 turnovers the whole game. I'm calling it now.
Really? Because this is a perfect way for me to branch into, I'm really impressed with the Flyers defense at this point. I think that they're a unit to really keep our eyes on in the back half of the season. I mean, they've got size, they got versatility, they've got a couple of young players just balling out in sort of their roles and being really spark plugs. I'm talking about rookies Christian Bellis and John Wellers. Like, they've really shown that they can step up and handle their individual matchups. Like, I do think, as opposed to last year where Carolina lost the season series 3-1 and had no real leverage against the Atlanta offense, in 2024, I feel like this Carolina defensive unit can absolutely enact some pressure. And that's what they did in their first two matchups. I mean, they held Atlanta to just 35 total goals in 2 games. The hustle have been explosive in their other matchups in 2024. And yet Carolina was kind of able to put a little bit of a cap on them. And I know you're going to respond and say that the hustle were down some of their offensive starters. And I'll hear that out. But I do think that Carolina can match up very well with the hustle, and in particular with Brett Holzmeier. They're going to have Matt Tucker, Drew Swanson, and maybe even Henry Fisher available to throw some size at one of the MVP favorites.
I don't think size bothers him. Did you see what he did to Colorado when they put size on him? Because that didn't
I
seem
mean,
to
Colorado did not have the kind of skilled size that Carolina has. I'm sorry. I just don't think
I
that
don't
Colorado.
know. Here's the thing with Holzmeier. I don't think size matters because like size isn't the issue because he's not a big guy that just goes and does big guy things, right? Like this isn't like what I saw when Misha Freistadter was scoring however many 100-something goals where they were just Cole Sullivan was just rearing back and throwing, Hail Marys every possession and Misha was just like, I'm bigger and better at reading a disc than you. That's not what Holzmeier does. Like he gets the disc all over the field and um, you know, that's why he's so good because he can definitely go big boy you, which we've seen him do over and over again. And he doesn't just like high point discs. He bodies, he gets position, and he gives you no chance to get it. But the real problem is that you have to basically back him if you don't want him to go deep because if you're even with him, he's got the foot speed and he's got the stamina to just run you all over the field. And if you just bite a little too much in or you get too close to him on the mark and he can throw and take off, that's where you really get yourself into trouble. So like size to me is irrelevant when you're guarding Holzmeier. It's can you guard him all over the field and then still contest the deep when he does take off? He had an amazing game actually individually in their first game of the season.
He did.
And a lot of that was through what he was able to do through his throwing. And you, that's the other part of it, right? You can sit there and say, well, we'll just let him touch the disc a lot, not in the end zone. But the problem is he's been really efficient with the disc, not in the end zone. And he's also liable to throw a great deep shot to a teammate. So I think it becomes a lot more complex than just like we're going to throw size at him. And I mean, I've played against Drew Swanson, I've played against Matt Tucker, and I'm sorry, but those dudes can't guard Brett Holzmeier.
Look, I'm not saying you just throw size at him and that solves the complexity of Hallsmeier's game at this point. I totally agree with you. I think Hallsmeier, as I've said repeatedly on the show, is the most versatile big in the league right now with how he's playing.
Not even close.
Like you can't solve him in the handler space, and if you push him downfield, he's just too big to handle. I just think you need to present him with some sort of size so that he doesn't just go downfield and rampage all over you as he did a few weeks ago against the Summit. And I do feel like Carolina has some defenders who can handle him in a way. I think what becomes interesting is kind of the point that you brought up, which is that Hallsmeier absolutely filled it up in one of the two meetings against Carolina previously this season, and yet it didn't really matter in terms of the overall outcome. And it kind of feels like, and I'm going to draw a comparison here to the NBA, of what teams do with the Denver Nuggets with Nikola Jokic, where you just kind of let him get his fill, and maybe he has some kind of crazy triple-double and box score stat line, but you don't let the shooters around him get into rhythm. And I think that that's what Carolina can do with their size and the rest of their defensive rotation and sort of limiting this hustle attack, that they can maybe say, okay, Hallsmeier, go get yours, but we're not going to let Jeremy Langdon go off for 4+ goals. We're not going to let Matt Smith get close to 300 total yards without a mistake and just sort of be the cleaner fish in the interstitial spaces all over the field. Like, I think that Carolina has a pretty good mindset of understanding that you're not just going to stop Brett Halsmeyer, you have to contain him. And then you have to understand that by containing him, you're going to be limiting the amount of effect he has, to your point of becoming a distributor, of launching deep to Langdon or Eckwertzel or somebody else streaking.
Yeah, I think the first game, though, the biggest problem Atlanta had, like, yeah, Holzmeyer went off, but the reason that they struggled so much and lost by so much is because two reasons. Number one, they didn't field like any polls cleanly in like the second and third quarters, especially the third quarter, I think it was. They like were never prepared. Multiple times they had to take a disc like at the goal line or like somewhere outside out. And then without those connector pieces of Olsen and Smith, and I remember us talking about this, they didn't have like that connection really to like get the disc moving and like have somebody available in those short spaces. I mean, they turned a disc over where it hit the ground basically still in their end zone, like because they were just so bad at getting possessions started. They seem to have cleaned some of that up, and I think there's a couple other things too, like Atlanta at home. They seem to never have like any real weather there. Like it might be humid, hot and humid, but they're not going to have like a lot of wind. Which it seems like in the Carolina games, it seems like there's pretty regularly a decent amount of wind. I think that bodes really well also for like their D line and how they're going to be able to convert. Something we haven't talked about yet is that hustle D line that I think, they are averaging not about the same amount of blocks. I think they're at 10 a game. The Flyers are at 10.17 for all intents and purposes, of essentially averaging the same amount of blocks per game. And I think they've been they've been a unit that has been really good at converting breaks. Shocker. They're fourth right now in defensive line conversion percentage, and they're getting tons of opportunities. I just don't think at home, and what I'm assuming is going to be your typical Atlanta, like pretty calm, like almost non-existent weather with that offense. And as well, I think they've been clicking on all cylinders for like a few weeks now. I just think it's going to be really hard for Carolina to really go out there and affect them too much. That being said, like we haven't spent any time talking about the Carolina offense, which also is incredible. Like you talked about how well Alan Laviolette's been playing. Anders Jungst is maybe, I know a couple weeks ago I said he's my favorite at the moment for MVP of the league. So, we're spending all this time talking about Atlanta's offense. Like Carolina's offense can be just as lethal. They don't do it exactly the same way. They don't look the same, but they get very similar results.
They've also been absent a few offensive starters in virtually every game this year, kind of rotating in a new piece here and there, and have seemingly lost no level of efficiency despite who's sort of juggling into that starting rotation on O-line. I mean, to the point of who's been available in every game, just 3 offensive starters have played in all 6 of the Flyers games so far, and that's Alexander Wilcox, Elijah Long, and Terrence Mitchell. Laviolette, Jungst, Fairfax, Bloodworth, all have missed time at various stretches. Trevor Lynch continues to flip-flop back and forth on offense or defense. He's played in all 6 games, but as a captain, he's kind of filled in wherever needed. It speaks to the sort of next man up approach that this Flyers team has adapted, which is so viciously daunting, I feel like, for opponents, given the overall talent of Carolina, that they have this kind of grind set mindset mentality.
Yeah, Carolina, I mean, outside of last year, which was kind of an anomaly, like every year they have just one of the deepest teams, not only like throughout their whole 30-man, overall roster, but also just the flexibility that they have within their roster, I feel like is not really talked about that much. And I guess because a lot of times you don't want to have to go into the flexibility spot, right? Like you want your top players in the position that, would best suit them or best suit the team. But yeah, they might have the most flexible lineup in the league. Like half of their D-line guys were O-line starters on the team that went to championship weekend in 2022. Like a team that some of us stupidly thought was going to beat New York, myself included. So like there's how many other teams can you go down and be like, oh, look, yeah, they have a really good O-line. Oh, look at their D-line. It's 7 guys who made it to championship weekend as O-line starters. Like that's pretty daunting and intimidating to go up against. Not like what other team could you even say that about?
Yeah, and it gets into a little bit of the aspect of, is there a depreciating return on the kind of depth that the Flyers have? I don't think so this season, given how well their top star performers are performing, but I do think that in years past they've maybe struggled a bit to identify their top 7 in any given game, or who they necessarily want to roll out. Feel like that was a little bit of their problem last year in their first round playoff loss at Austin. This year, that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be actually imbuing them with more power.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think it's just because they have players who are like nobody's seems to have an ego about it, right? Like, on some teams, I've had these conversations with players too. Like, I've played on the O line in Indy since 2012, and I've had conversations with younger players or players who have come in, and they feel like if they aren't on the O line, like that's somehow like a slap in the face that maybe they aren't as good as they thought they were. And some people believe like your top 7 players, that they're the ones who are out there on the O line, and that might be the case some places. And I think you could make an argument that, especially if you're on a team that has less overall talent, you probably do need to stack your O line as much as possible to give yourself a fighting chance in games. But when you have a team that's as deep as Carolina, you really can. You don't have to just say you're our 7 best overall players. You can say like this group of 7 gives us the best offense. Like they might not even have the best offensive skills all as individuals, but just the way that they work together as a unit of 7 people on the field becomes like way more important. And I think that's what Carolina is able to do. They're able to take people and put a group of 7 out there that they think is going to perform the best. And then they're able to have still so much talent left that they're able to put another group of 7 out there for a D line that's like all 7 of you are monsters defensively. You communicate well together. You know how to play off of one another. You know how to switch effectively without losing track of your matchups. And that's something I think the Carolina is so good at, is just being able to have a unit out there, because it doesn't feel like 7 individuals ever for Carolina on the field. It feels like a 7-man unit that is working together to accomplish a goal. And that is not something you can say about every team across the league.
I think that's a terrific point, and I'll say one of the only other teams that I think can claim that too is Atlanta, given how their offense works in sync, given the kind of total defensive effort that they give. And with that, I want to just kind of label a couple X factors in this game. I think for Atlanta, this is an obvious one. Justin Burnett. He's just been such an elevated player in their big matchups this year. I mean, he basically made 3 of the biggest plays in their win against New York, disrupting the reigning champions' 31-game winning streak. He figures to be one of the finalists for Defensive Player of the Year at the end of this year. He's just one of those guys who, even if he doesn't win the individual point matchup, he will find a way to get a block at some point, whoever he's guarding.
Yeah, and the thing I love about him, and I got to experience this firsthand, and he guarded me in our matchup in Indy this year. The thing that I love about him as a defender is you see the highlight plays, right? Like you see the big layouts, the skies, you see the reading and reacting maybe on a poach. But what you don't see sometimes, and because it's not like the highlight play, is that dude is like constantly going. Like he has a really high motor, and he is not somebody who ever gives up on a play, and he's not somebody who ever just like feels like he's beat and can't make up ground. And that's so different than like so many people's mentalities. Like, and I can tell you, I've been guarded by a lot of people over the course of 12 seasons, and he is the one of only, I would say, 2 defenders I've faced in that entire time that I can say has a motor like that. Like he is one of 2 out of every person that's ever and that includes club. Like that includes every ultimate experience I've had. But the difference between him and the other guy is also the athleticism, the quickness, the speed, the ability that he has to create those turnovers as well. And so hats off to him. He's great. I love watching him play. I 100% agree. Like, could be a huge X factor in this game. I think a lot of Atlanta's success in this game, I think offensively they're going to perform very well. Defensively, I think a lot of it is going to be like, what kind of chaos can Justin Burnett cause? Like, how I see him. He shows up in big games too. Like, it seems like the bigger the spotlight, the more he's going to perform. So I'd be shocked if he doesn't come out of this game with a couple blocks.
And then for Carolina, this is kind of an also obvious duh. Saul Yannick, he's been practicing and playing with the Worlds team for a while. He was at Windmill last weekend. He hasn't played with the Flyers too much this season. He started in just 2 games, the season opener against Atlanta, and then also their 7-goal win against Austin. But he's just a gamer, man. And especially now that he's kind of in his more natural role on defense, I just feel like there's going to be some moment where he gets a block in the backfield and a quick transition score that might really ignite the Flyers on the road.
Saul Yannick is one of my favorite Flyers players. And it's for the reason you just said. Like, he has that ability to just like kind of quick strike and start a counterattack really quickly, but also like he can quarterback the team too. I mean, he quarterbacked the 2021 team that won the title and was an O-line starter for him in 2020. He's one of these guys I was talking about, right? That like he has seasons under his belt where he was an O-line starter, and now you have him as also a really great defender who has all this offensive experience. So when they do force turnovers, he has all of the tools in his tool belt to be able to get a drive started, or even, like you said, get a block in the backfield and make something happen quickly. I think that's a great pick for the X Factor. You said obvious, and in the 2 seconds before you said Yannick's name, I went through like 10 Flyers.
Oh, dude, I was about to too.
I was like, is it really that obvious? Because I feel like you could
okay.
be like,
he's a Worlds game player. Like, I feel like that kind of gives him an added element of gravitas to his game. But I mean, I was almost going to pick Trevor Lynch, who, as a captain this season, I've just been so impressed with his quality of play. I don't know how else to express it, but like, I remember a couple weeks ago
last week
when they got that win at Austin a couple weeks ago, where they were rain delayed for a while, and then they came back on the field. It was a very physical game. The refs were a little bit all over the place. Trevor Lynch was rabid screaming after every single Flyers score and just pumping everybody up. And he's become such a visible leader on this team. And even talking with members of Carolina, they are so indebted to the leadership class of Lynch and Coffin, and I'm gonna space on the third one right now, which is gonna kill me. Anders Jungs, if you're listening to this, please just tear me apart in a DM. The leadership and captain class of this Flyers team has really taken them to a next level this year. I mean, Coach DeNardis has even kind of said he's a little bit more hands-off than he has been in a few years because of how good the leadership has been. And I think that comes from Lynch. So to your point, I also had like a basically 6-chamber ready at hand gun for who would be my biggest X factor for Carolina. Because, hey, you could choose Yannick, Lynch, Terrence Mitchell's been fantastic, Durs, Fairfax. I would even go so far to say Drew Swanson or like a Cooper Williams in this kind of matchup.
Grayson Sander.
Take your pick. Grayson Sander has been fantastic. Here's an interesting storyline for this matchup. How about Grayson Sander basically being undefeated as a pro? I think he might have one loss,
right?
Versus Adam Miller, who is also sporting a perfect record in the pros in his starts. Ooh. So there's kind of this talisman vibe for each team. These players who maybe don't start every single game and haven't necessarily been a part of the headline starting rotations for either team, as long as some of the other stars on these notable rosters. But Miller and Sander figure to be big components in this matchup as well. we could continue on for probably another half hour with this one, but we've got to move forward. Let's move to the game of the week in the Central Division. 5-2 Madison at 5-1 Minnesota. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, Minnesota claimed the first meeting between these two teams this season by 4 goals in Madison back on Memorial Day weekend. But Radicals, coming off of this Colorado win and being such a young team in need of a foothold, in need of kind of that sort of quality victory, I feel like are going to be a much different opponent for the wind chill on Saturday night.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this one. This is, they're actually, I think, starting their game right at the same time that we are. So this is one I'm going to have to go back and watch. But this is probably the most excited I've been for a Madison, Minnesota game since 2018. I mean, Madison just hasn't quite been on the same level as Minnesota. I mean, maybe in 2019 before we kind of realized that the Radicals empire was kind of crumbling and falling.
That was the first time Minnesota got their victory at Breese Stevens Field, ending years of turmoil in that stadium.
Hey, same. We also got our first win there that year.
Everyone kind of got their break back in against Madison in that venue in 2019.
Yeah, I haven't lost there since. It's been great. I hope that continues. So I think it's the one thing that kind of stinks. There are a couple of notable absences, and I'd be curious as to your opinion on which one is bigger or which one. So Madison, notably without Pat Schreiwise, who has been in the backfield with Kai Marcus, and Minnesota without Matt Rader, and Brandon Mattis. It's funny because on one hand, I would tend to lean that favors Madison because Matt Rader just presents so many problems. And, he was late to the game because of some travel issues when they played in Madison. But once he showed up, he put his imprint on the game pretty much immediately. And Brandon Mattis, of course, I think day one wind chiller had, just scored his 100th goal last week, which was a big one against Colorado. And, has been a defensive leader for them for years. But with it, Madison, as great as they've been playing, still feels like a team that really struggles in the handler space and sometimes just to get the disc moving. So even though it's just one person to the 2 absences over in Minnesota that are really notable, it kind of feels like this might be advantage Minnesota, especially because Minnesota is so good at disrupting what opposing offenses want to do. It feels like taking one of your best throwers out of the lineup could spell some trouble for Madison.
Yeah, and at the same time, I'm less worried about Madison's offense against Minnesota than I am about the Radicals' defense being able to replicate the results that they've had so far. They lead the league in break rate. They're top of the league in defensive efficiency in terms of punching in those break scores. They're limiting teams. They're getting a lot of pressure. They lead they lead the league in takeaways, but they've been doing that against some of the more sparsely populated offenses in terms of like Colorado. Like that was not their traditional starting offense. And then they've had 3 games against Detroit. And so I don't know that I fully buy into some of the statistical successes of Madison's defense at this point in the season. And I'm waiting to see if they can get that kind of purchase against a Minnesota team playing at home.
Yeah, I did miss Minnesota also without Quinn Snyder this weekend. I'm just wondering if Minnesota is really going to be able, we know that they're probably still going to shoot it. I do wonder what their deep game looks like down 2 of their 3 big guys. Colin Berry's not a small man either, but I do think that this could it's going to be an interesting game. I don't know. I think you're right. Can their defense hold up against Minnesota's offense? It held up just enough against Colorado, right? It looked like it was holding up plenty. And in the second half, Colorado really, clawed their way back and almost was able to tie the game despite the pretty big lead that had been built by Madison. So I think Kai Marcus has to be better in this game, though. If he goes out and has the same type of performance that he did against Colorado, where he had 7 throwaways. Minnesota is so good at converting break opportunities. I just don't think that Madison's going to be able to withstand that. So they need to find ways to still generate looks in the deep game while avoiding while avoiding another situation where the announcer's like, "There's no way Kai Marcus is going to throw deep again." Oh, just kidding. It's happening right now.
That was my favorite moment from Colin Camp, working with him in the booth the past couple of seasons, was him very stoically saying, "I don't know if I'm going to like another deep look," and then being interrupted by the deep look going up and getting swatted away for the 7th throwaway.
Yeah, I don't know that Kai Marcus has an off button. He certainly hasn't had an off button since in the UFA. Like, I don't know if it's existed in college. I don't know if it existed anywhere else. My guess is no, because this sort of heavy volume, like, I'll kind of take any shot anytime I think I can get it. Like, usually that's a habit that's built up over time, right? I think he needs to pick his spots a little bit more for Madison to have success in this game, especially because, like you said, how good is their defense really? It might be really good. It's looked really good at times. It looked really good at times in the Colorado game. But is that the real McCoy, or have we been duped by, as you mentioned, like a schedule that hasn't been super difficult yet? But Kai Marcus is going to have to be a little more choosy if they're going to have success in this game. I just don't. They can't withstand those types of turnovers the way they did last week.
It's such an interesting double-edged sword, right? Because Marcus so clearly adds a vertical dimension to this Madison offense that they've been struggling to find for over half a decade now, basically. And so I understand the leniency towards the green light that they allow for him. But to your point, and to even my co-broadcaster in the booth, like, there's just moments where you're sort of awestruck at the sheer audacity of, I'm going to take every look that's available downfield.
Yeah, it feels like something you would see from a team that's underperforming or not winning a lot of games. Like, right, this is something we would see with like Joe Cubit in Detroit. Like,
or
hey,
Portland. Portland is another
yeah.
team this season that has lived by the hook, die by the hook. They can be punchy when it's landing, and then they can completely get goose-egged in the first quarter, as they did the past weekend against Seattle, because they just don't have a short or intermediate game to rely upon.
Now, this isn't I just want to read off the list of the top 5 teams and Hucks attempted this year. And, you're going to notice, or I guess I should say, like, Hucks per game would be a better metric. Dallas Legion, number 1. How many wins they got?
0. Sorry, I didn't realize that was a real question.
Yeah, real question. Nitro, our third. How many wins they got?
1.
1? Right. So, like, these teams, we see this with teams. Like, sometimes it's like, I'm not, now there are some teams that huck a lot, but they're like really successful at it. So it's like, okay, we're going to keep hucking because we're successful at doing this thing. Right. That's not necessarily like, the Flyers are second in hucks per game, but they're a team that hucks it really well. And, that's why they huck it more. Madison's at the 4th most hucks per game right now, and they can definitely connect on those against lesser competition. Like, we've seen it. They actually connected pretty well against Colorado. But it's more, there's like this weird thing with huck percentage where it's like, I don't really know where to put it sometimes, because if you finish a game with, say, 70% huck percentage, that sounds like that's pretty good. And if you threw 10 hucks, that's pretty good. But if you threw 20 hucks, that's 6 turnovers. Like, and that's just the turnovers you had on hucks. That's not including any other turnovers. So there's like this weird dynamic where huck percentage can be somewhat of an indicator, but if you're throwing a mass volume of them, you still count the turnovers. The turnovers count the same. It's not any different just because it was a huck, right? So it's not enough for me to just see like, oh, you completed like 65% of your hucks, because if you're throwing 20 of them, that just tells me that you had too many turnovers in the deep game. And I don't think Madison needs to just rely on it. You're right. He adds a dimension that other teams are going to have to worry about. And when he has the disc, you're going to have to worry that a deep shot's going up. But I feel like you need to find ways to use that more to your advantage as an offense, where everyone's freaking out when Kai has the disc, and they're so worried about the deep shot that you can find these easier intermediate shots, right? Like that's the thing with like Nethercutt, that like I think sometimes he does really well and sometimes he kind of slips into trying to throw it deep too much. Is he's such a threat from anywhere on the field to throw it into the end zone that he can just kind of get whatever throw he wants, and like he can break it across the field, and it changes the way you have to play defense. But you can't fall in love with just throwing it deep. You have to use that to your advantage, to where you can hit these open unders and then take advantage of the deeps when they're really there, right? When they're really open and you don't have to worry about defense contesting the disc as much.
One thing I wanted to switch to too, that is a concern I think for Madison, is how they handle Brian Vanuka in this matchup. He was an absolute sore in their side in their first meeting this season. He didn't commit a turnover on May 24th. He was 28 of 29 on throws, but he had 4 assists, 3 goals, a block, and almost 500 total yards of offense in a rain-soaked game that was delayed for over 2 hours. He's just kind of been in rhythm in this matchup against the Radicals the past couple of times too. And when he's able to be his most efficient self, he can be one of the best strikers in this league and one of the best continuation throwers and players in the sport. And I just don't know right now that the Radicals have a defender who can really address the kind of versatility that Bevon provides for this Minnesota offense. And again, as good as Madison's defense has been, and as good as Luke Marks, Jake Carrigo, Pierre Robert, Joe Liebforth, and I'm sure I'm forgetting other people right now, have been, there's not a clear matchup for Minnesota's captain.
Yeah, he's playing great. Hey, you wear number 3, you profit. Okay, that's all
that is astute observation, my friend.
Yeah, hey, Jake Carrico's having a great year too. Speaking of number 3s, yeah, Bevon, he's a problem because he can kind of do it all over the field. He was the one who at the in that Madison game at the end of the first quarter, when Josh Klain got that flick through the double team at the end of the quarter. Who was it that came down with it? Bevon, of course, because it's what he does. He just makes huge plays all the time. Because that's the thing. He's not just like, he's this incredibly consistent player in terms of like the production that he has out there, but he's also this like maybe the most prone to make a highlight on that team as well. Like, he makes some ridiculous catches. It seems like every year he's got a catch that's like, I think, up there for potential catch of the year. Had one against us in the regular season last year where it almost like he like laid out and almost like crawled on the ground while he was still in the air to get to the disc. Had that huge sky up I think at championship weekend too. He shows up in big games too, and I mean, this is, probably the biggest game on Minnesota's schedule so far this season. This would be them being able to wrap up the head-to-head advantage and really put a lock on the top of this division, because Minnesota is the only team that has 1 loss in the Central right now. They would be the only team. Every other team would have at least 3 losses.
Dang it, you took my talking point from me.
Yeah. So it basically, like, it doesn't guarantee that Minnesota gets first place in the division, but it gets them pretty close because they have the head-to-head already locked up against Pittsburgh and against Indy. They would have the head-to-head at that point locked up against Madison. The only team they would have to lock up head-to-head against would be Chicago, because they do have 2 more matchups with the Union this year. So that winning this game is almost securing them first place in the division. So in a division that is the muddiest out of all of them in terms of like who is and isn't potentially going to make the playoffs. This would give us at least kind of one clear team that's like pretty much locked into the playoffs after this weekend.
Well, and that's how Minnesota is seeing themselves in the Central Division, right? Like they
They
want to
should.
show that they're a cut above the rest. They really take a lot of pride in how far they pushed Salt Lake in their semifinal matchup in 2023. And I think that that's a large motivating factor as to how they're approaching this season. I mean, I think that they are taking this matchup very seriously, and to your point, can understand that they will almost establish an insurmountable lead within the divisional standings. But I think they're also looking to kind of use this as a springboard for the matchup that they have upcoming in a couple weekends at home against the reigning champions from New York. Like, this is all a part of the grander scheme that I think the coaching staff of Ben Feldman and Max Longchamp and everyone else working for Minnesota's coaching staff has been pushing since the preseason, which is that each win builds upon the last. You can just sort of feel that with this wind chill team where the Colorado win connects into this win, connects into what they're going to be building for New York. And they've talked extensively about how last year they felt like they would have been a good matchup for the Empire. And this year they have even more talent with, I feel like, Soval Fernandez joining on offense, Matt Rader becoming such an integral part. You heard Josh Klain at the end of the last game talking in the post-game interview about how Rader has just added a different level of championship experience to this Minnesota team that is desperately in need of that kind of leadership. And so I don't know, man. Like, I think that Minnesota really takes this game seriously. And I think that Madison really has a difficult test in front of them as far as staying in that second place spot in the Central Division. You know, you talk about Minnesota vaulting up with the win. Madison, if they lose and you know, you guys win in Indianapolis, or Chicago beats you, or Pittsburgh gets their win against Detroit, I mean, that all pushes the tide that much closer to a Radicals team that is right now sitting a little bit above the waterline.
Yeah, it's just a mess. I do want to give a shout out to Josh Klain. I have been very critical of Josh Klain, not really on this podcast because, well, since we started recording, I haven't had a reason to be. But he's someone that I think has just improved so much this year in just his like overall play, decision making, execution, everything. Like I think I even said this to you. I know I said it to other people when he was a late scratch in the championship weekend last year before their Salt Lake game. I actually thought that benefited them because I thought they needed by putting Tristan Mortel back there. I thought that was going to give them a little bit more ability to hold on to the disc and to not risk some maybe bad throwaways in the deep game. And I felt pretty confident about that. But the way Josh Klain is playing this year, I think he has really stepped up in his execution decision making this year. And I don't know what's changed. I mean, certainly getting a guy like Matt Rader to throw deep to couldn't have hurt. And maybe as you spoke to like Josh Klain talking about the championship kind of mentality and experience that Rader brings to this team, could be something to do with that. But I've just been so impressed with the way he's been playing this year because I really felt like over the last few seasons, he had kind of the games where Minnesota was performing the best on offense tended to be the ones where you kind of forgot he was on the field. Like he wasn't really impacting the game that much. And he was just kind of existing there alongside the rest of the offense. And I feel like so opposite this year where I feel like the games where he's really asserted himself have been marks of success for this offense. So shout out to Josh Klain, playing awesome this year. I've been really impressed.
I don't disagree with you, and I absolutely think that he deserves flowers for his ability to be so central to Minnesota's offensive success. As you mentioned earlier, the buzzer beater throw he had at the end of the first quarter in Madison
Insane
a couple
throw.
weeks ago, that was instrumental in reestablishing the Wind Chill's momentum in that game. I mean, they completely seized the matchup from that point forward.
Oh yeah.
And I think Clayton deserves a remarkable amount of credit for that. I also think this past weekend, he had that one throw to Raider that was a set play coming out of a timeout and a pretty crucial point in the game where he just drilled a throw in the rain and the elements that I don't think a lot of throwers can. But because I'm always somebody who's kind of a devil's advocate and likes to complicate things, he does have 4 straight starts with multiple throwaways, and he's only
Sure.
completing 91.7% of his throws on the season. So I still think there's a little bit of that two Clanes element of he still has a green light, a little bit like Kai Marcus, where you're not always sure if the shot going up is going to find its intended receiver.
Yeah, I mean the stats, especially for throwing percentage, look that way. I think that can be
It's tough,
explained away
man.
a
It's
little
tough.
bit.
I'll immediately qualify with what I just said. With he plays in one of the most adverse home stadiums in the entire league in Seafoam. We've
Yeah.
mentioned multiple times. There's just a wind tunnel effect in that venue that really belabors throwers, and so I think some of his maybe less than optimal throwing percentage numbers are a artifact of that. It's just I
There's
don't know.
also like the game in Madison where it was just like incredibly wet and humid, like because they actually, they had to delay the game because of thunderstorms. And so it's like, it's one of those things where if you just looked at the stats, you're like, Cam, you're an idiot. Like, starting handler throwing, 91%, like this guy's playing like garbage. But I think, yeah, it's like when you actually, as you do, obviously, with every single game in the league, and I try to as much as I can. When you actually watch the play, you can kind of see, like, oh yeah, he had these throwaways against Colorado last week, but as you mentioned, I think it was in our recap, like him and Will Brandt combined for like 7 or 8 throwaways, but it was more a function of like they were the ones who were trusted to make the throws in the really tough conditions, and as a result, there was just going to be some turnovers that happened throughout the course of the game. And they were just the ones who were trusted to make the most throws, so that's just how it goes sometimes. I think his high turnover game last week against Colorado is very different than the one from Kai Marcus, where they seemed to be playing in like pretty much ideal conditions, and Kai's just like taking bad shots that are getting D'd.
I don't disagree with you there. Again, like I'm only introducing these stats to complicate a narrative. It's to take nothing away from Clayton's performances in Minnesota's wins. They sit at 5-1, and he is a clear team leader for them, and has been playing as well as he has throughout his career, and clearly has a really good 1-2 connection with Matt Raider, which I think is going to be a clear edge in the Central Division that doesn't have a lot of challenges for that kind of optimal offensive duo.
Yeah.
But
well, there are 11 other games on the schedule, I think.
There are 11 other games, and so we're not going to get to all of them. And again, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, there are a lot of kind of down schedule matchups that don't necessarily feed into the playoff narrative. So instead, I think what would be most fruitful for us is to discuss the 4 teams that really stand to gain the most or fall out of contention this coming weekend. And unfortunately, one of those 4 teams is going to be yours. So I know I'm putting you on a bit of a tightrope here. But let's talk about 3-4 San Diego, 2-5 Colorado, 3-3 Indianapolis, and 4-3 Chicago for a moment, will we? San Diego plays Colorado on Friday night tomorrow before heading to Oakland on Saturday night. Both games figure to be of absolute importance for either set of teams, whether it be San Diego, Colorado, or Oakland. They can all stand to either basically end their seasons in week 9 or keep themselves alive enough, particularly for San Diego and Colorado, to exist for another weekend. Indianapolis and Chicago, you guys face off head-to-head in Chicago. Alley Cats claimed the thrilling 1-goal victory where you yourself reeled in the buzzer beater at the end of regulation. I know that was impugned a little bit by the following day's results in Pittsburgh, but Indianapolis does currently hold the head-to-head matchup over Chicago, even though the Union sit a half game above you in the standings. So another win would secure the season series against ostensibly one of the teams vying for the third and final playoff spot in the Central. I hesitate to even say some of that stuff because, again, there's so much tumultuousness within the Central Division that Madison's current 5-2 standing in second place could be very different even 2 weeks from now, depending on the results of games. So I don't want to entirely sort of bundle together Indianapolis, Chicago, and Pittsburgh as the sole teams vying for that third and final playoff spot in the division. But right now, that is where it stands. So this Alley Cats Union matchup has a significant amount of importance for both teams. I wanted to ask you, which team can least afford a loss? I feel like the most obvious answer is 2-5 Colorado, given that another defeat will effectively eliminate them from the playoffs in the West Division, which would be completely stunning, I think, given that we're not even in the final month of the regular season. To have a team as talented as the Summit eliminated from postseason contention just seems wild, but we're in chaos season after all. But I don't know if I actually think that that is the most significant loss that could happen. I feel like, and we were kind of talking about this in the pregame, if Chicago drops this game against you guys, they will now have losses against Minnesota, Pittsburgh, and Indianapolis. And with an upcoming matchup at Madison against a really revitalized Radical squad, that is looking like a really tough test, given that they just escaped with a 1-goal win a couple weekends ago against Madison. Where do your thoughts lie in this? Like, what team are you most looking forward to showing you something in week 9 from the 4 contenders we listed?
So yeah, I think I'm kind of in the same boat as you. Like going to, I don't quite put it on Colorado, which might seem weird because, as you mentioned, like losing this game, I think technically, depending on how things shake out, they wouldn't necessarily be eliminated from the playoffs yet. But I mean, Colorado's in a situation right now where even if they win out, they could still not make the playoffs. So it's kind of hard for me to say like that this loss is really like the one that we need to focus on because they've kind of already had that loss happen to them multiple times at this point. And so their playoff hopes are so slim that I I don't know how, I guess if I would really say it's them, but I think it is Chicago. And it's just because of the way it sets up the rest of the season for them, like you said. So they lose to us. That puts them at 4-4 and us at 4-3. So we would obviously leapfrog them in the standings. We'd also have the head to head on them, which means that not only we're basically another game up on them, they would have to finish with a better record than us to make the playoffs over us. They, as you mentioned, already have losses, a loss to Minnesota, a loss to Pittsburgh. Um, they only have 2 wins in the division. They're at 4-3, but 2 of those wins are in Texas. So then you start to think about division. If there is a tiebreaker where it comes down to division record, they have not fared so well in the division yet. They are 2-2 in the division, or sorry, 2-3 in the division, and they would be dropping to 2-4 in the division should they lose this game. So Chicago has their playoff chances going from looking like decent right now to like really putting themselves in a bind if they lose this weekend. So I think they probably are the team that most would be hurt by a loss this weekend.
Yeah, I feel like it comes down to the 2 Central Division teams, both because Chicago and Indianapolis don't really have a win that is discernible this season. I know Chicago has a win against Madison, which is now sitting at 5-2, but that was kind of by a goal, and there were some really questionable moments towards the end of that game due to some reffing decisions. So in a 1-goal game, that kind of felt like a bit of a toss-up. I think that given the kind of performance that they had against Pittsburgh, if they don't get another win to sort of solidify themselves, it could be a similar situation as they had a season ago where, yeah, they could maybe make a playoff game, but it's going to be backpedaling into that position. And there's just not going to be enough momentum to sustain them in any kind of second half push.
Yeah, they're right now. They didn't have John Lithia last weekend, which I thought was a big miss for them. Him and Jake Rubin Miller are both listed as questionable right now. Um, I hope they can play. Those guys are great, and I like to compete against teams when they're when they're all there and healthy. So hopefully they're able to play. But yeah, I mean their offense last week really struggled. It's been struggling most of the season. The one game where it really didn't struggle, I would say, didn't struggle too much against Madison. I think they did put up 20 goals in that game, if I'm remembering correctly, or maybe upper teens. The game against us indoors was by far their best offensive game. Um, but that stadium they're playing in looks to be very windy from the games I've watched. And you mentioned how well Minnesota kind of navigates their home field, and we've talked about that extensively on the show. And Chicago kind of feels like the opposite right now, where their home field doesn't seem like much of an advantage because it seems like they really struggle in that windy weather as much as any team coming to visit them. So I'm sure as they get more games in there, they'll start to adjust and be able to like use that to their advantage the same way we see Minnesota does it. But it seems like it's kind of been a thorn in their side as much as it has been opponents. So um, yeah, it's going to be a hot one though. It's going to be in the 90s when that game tips off. So heat wave just hit the Central this week. I know probably down in Texas they're like, oh, 90s, it's been that way for weeks here, but we just hit the 90s this week and you can feel it.
Oh yeah, same here in Madison. It's absolutely sweltering with like 85-90% humidity to go along with
Yep.
it. It's real thick air out there. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of conditions y'all are playing in Lakeside on Friday night. But I also wanted to talk about the West Division games because I don't think that we should be remiss enough to skip over San Diego and the kind of season that they're having. I mean, again, they're only at 3-4. And the 3 wins that they've gotten haven't been by any stretch of the imagination quality or against playoff opponents, but they played Salt Lake as well as anyone within the West Division. They continue to punch down on teams when they get the opportunity to. I mean, they absolutely blew out LA this last weekend. They'll be without KJ Koo, who has been nothing short of a star for them in his 2 starts so far this season. He's averaging 7.5 goals and 650 odd yards of total offense in his 2 starts so far in 2024. So he's been an even more productive player than perennial all UFA selection and future Hall of Famer Travis Dunn. He will not be available for them on the road trip through Colorado and Oakland. So can San Diego find a way through Dunn and other means to get at least one win against either the Summit or the Spiders to keep their season alive? Because I feel like if they go 0-2, they slip to 3-6, and that's basically the end of San Diego's playoff hopes. But if they can construct some sort of hard-fought win on either Friday night in Colorado or maybe a little bit more improbably against this fired up Spiders team that will absolutely know the stakes of getting a win against the Growlers on Saturday and really putting them in a hole. I don't know. My mind just goes so many places. There's 3 remaining games between San Diego and Oakland, so this is by no means a settled affair. But if Oakland can get a win, improve to 5-2, and either put San Diego in a 4-5 hole or a 3-6 hole heading into the final few games of their schedule, that will be kind of insurmountable for a Growlers team that, again, has been super feisty. I want to take nothing away from what the leadership and the coaching staff of Kevin Stewart and Kayla Helton have done for this team this year. I think that the Growlers are a really interesting sort of long-term development to watch, but they just haven't been able to get the edge against any quality opponents now for over a season and a half. And so can they make themselves relevant after, being the back-to-back West Division champions before these Colorado and Salt Lake teams became expansion elements in 2022?
They definitely. I think if they only win one game this weekend, it's going to have to be against Oakland. That's the more important one for sure, because very likely if they were to be vying for a playoff spot, it's going to come down to them in Oakland. Um, Oakland has a pretty easy path to 7 wins. They have a Portland game and 2 LA games remaining on their schedule outside of those 3 San Diego games. So at the very least, San Diego is going to have to find a way to get to 7 wins. And considering they play Oakland 3 times, they would need to make sure they have the head-to-head against Oakland as well. It just seems pretty. They're in a tough spot. I feel like they can't drop any of their 3 Oakland games. They need to sweep Oakland because they need to find a way to get not only to get to 7 wins and make sure Oakland doesn't have any more than 7 wins. So beating Colorado would be a great start to getting to 7 wins for San Diego. I do think this matchup in particular this weekend is going to be very difficult. That's not even like an easy road trip either. It's not like they're doing the California thing. They have to go out to Colorado, then come back to San Diego or back to Oakland, excuse me. You mentioned Oakland knowing the stakes. Is that a positive for them? They knew the stakes last year, and we saw how that turned out for them.
I mean, San Diego has to go from elevation to seaside, and given the kinds of opponents and general conditions that they're facing, it is one of the top 5 most difficult road trips to face, which is just a grueling task for this Growler team that, again, has been overcoming tragedy in 2023 with Goose Helton and the motorcycle accident and all of that stuff into 2024 where they're punchy and they're coming up, but there's still just this developmental and youth curve that exists in the West Division where unless you're Oakland and you're just able to restock every year with a seemingly new crop of ready-made rookie stars, you're just not going to be able to hang with the top end of the division.
So I guess the one thing we got to say though is like, if you're not watching Oakland Spiders Ultimate, then what are you doing with your life?
Yeah, I mean, Dan Silverstein really coming up with the evergreen quote of the season. Oakland has been now in what? Let me look at it really quick. I feel like...
Okay, wait. I have their schedule open right now. They've
been
have played 6 games and 5 of them have been
4 1-goal decisions so far this season, and then going back to last season, their last 3 games of 2023 were also 1-goal decisions. And then out of their last their last 11 games, that would be 8 games decided by a single goal. So if you want exciting ultimate, tune in to the Oakland Spiders on Saturday night versus the Growlers.
Also, there will be 40 turnovers because
also these are going to be physical games. The Growlers, the Summit, and the Spiders are 3 of the more physical teams in the entire UFA. So there's going to be some chippiness and a little bit of emotionality to really manage for all those squads.
Yeah, it is wild that Oakland keeps coming out on top of these. They're 8th in the league from the bottom in turnovers per game. Oh gosh, they just they muck up games for themselves and for the opponent. And I mean, if there's one thing, right, you hear about this in other sports all the time, like teams that do this where they win a lot by 1 goal or like 1 score, it tends to regress to the mean, right, over time. But I feel like they're on the upswing, right? Like they lost some close games last year, and they're like on the upswing, on the other side of it now, and it's like evening back out. So I feel like that's what's going on this year.
Yeah. I mean, there's just, again, it's chaos season. Everything seems to be equaling out towards like a middle ground. We have 1 undefeated team left. We've got 2 winless teams in Dallas and Detroit. And other than that, it's kind of anyone's guess what will happen in any given matchup. I mean, Montreal and Philadelphia were moments away from getting wins against championship level competition and yet just couldn't pull it off. Other weekends,
Yep.
it's been a complete reversal of what we expected. I anticipate nothing less from week 9. I completely expect some result from this slate to just throw a monkey wrench into whatever prognostications we made on this podcast.
Okay, I got one last thing before we get out of here because I know we're heading to the end of the podcast. I want to reference the power rankings that you put out, and specifically what you wrote about Detroit. Because, so, needless to say, Pittsburgh is throwing out a roster this weekend that
unrecognizable. I'll use that word.
It is. I will say this: I did see that Max Shepard was moved to active.
What? When did that happen? Did that happen before we started recording tonight?
I don't know. I just
pulled it up while we're recording.
Now I know his hamstring was in pretty rough shape when the injury happened. So I hope that this isn't him coming back too early, because for anyone it sounded like he had a definite pull, like not just some sort of strain. Like it was something a little more serious. So I hope for his case that this isn't like coming back too early. But outside of like him and Jonathan Mast and Pete Zaccardi, I mean, you go down this lineup and you're kind of like, who's the? I see Logan Call's name. I recognize him. I know he
Chris Graber. Chris Graber.
Yeah, Chris Graber's on there. But it's a bunch of names of I don't really recognize. Andrew Gardner, Coach Andrew Gardner is listed
GM
as active.
Andrew Gardner is active.
Or sorry, GM. He doesn't even have a number listed on there. It's just question marks in the number category. I mean, this Max Borowski.
Coach Max Borowski is listed as dressed too, yeah.
Yeah. This, I don't know. You talked about who could ill afford a loss. And like, this is one we didn't talk about because like, it's Detroit. Like, you don't talk about a team losing to Detroit because that literally just hasn't happened. Like I mentioned on the podcast, before my 4-year-old son was born. It's the last time they won, right? He has never seen.
If you had a 6-year-old son, it would also be longer than that.
So, that being said, Detroit has seemingly just about everyone, like all of their players who are kind of, Detroit's not devoid of talent, right? It's just been the situation where they do have some pieces that are always like, they have a few players who are definitely good and talented, and but they just don't have the 20, right? They don't have enough to come out on top. You wrote in the power rankings that this could be the week, and looking at the lineups, I mean, if there's a week they're gonna do it, it's this one where Pittsburgh seems to be missing just about everyone.
Pittsburgh, man, winners of 4 of their last 5. They currently sit with the most control of their playoff destiny of any of the 3 teams currently vying for the 3rd spot in the Central, Indy and Chicago included alongside them. And yeah, to your point, it could all really go into the blender this weekend if they somehow allow Detroit to get off the schneid and end this 81-game losing streak that completely dominates any other kind of similar sort of failure within professional sports. In the CBS Roadshow piece that aired just a couple weeks ago, I believe the closest comparison was the pre-modern NFL Cardinals when they were like the Chicago Cardinals or something.
Sounds right.
When they had 29 straight losses. Again, 81 is just, I'm not a math scholar, but that seems to be magnitudes more. And yeah, it could be finally on the chopping block this weekend if Jake Felton, Carson Chamberlain, and the rest of Detroit's playmakers can string together a successful 4 quarters. But as you alluded to in my power rankings, I also wrote, we've been here before, man.
We have.
We've been here a bunch of times. I've sat through a
We've been
lot
here before.
of upset alerts.
Yep.
Detroit up on a down roster, Madison squad on the road, and it still results in a double-digit loss for the Mechanics. So we'll see, man.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Well, we will. In fact, the closest they've come to winning a game during this streak was a very
2019.
similar. It was a very similar situation. Pittsburgh with a skeleton crew going to Detroit. The game went to double overtime. And Detroit, not only did Detroit receive the pole in double overtime, they turned it over twice and got it back twice. So they had 3 attempts to score in sudden death overtime before obviously not doing so and continuing the streak that was a lot smaller back then. But so we've literally seen like this exact song and dance before. Pittsburgh, skeleton crew going to Detroit.
Of note in that
I don't know where I
game,
lean.
of note,
I don't know where I lean on this. Like in the standings, it obviously helps us if Detroit wins, but like eventually Detroit's going to win a game, right? And like you don't want to be the team it happens. Like you don't want to be a part of that game, right?
That's probably why Max Shepard is active. And look, you referenced that 2019 game. Max Shepard, do you want to guess? Should I put an over-under on the amount of points he played? Because I know he played the entire second half in overtime, just off the top of my head. He finished with 12
He had to have played
12
35.
assists, 4 goals, 2 blocks, 46 completions on the game. You say 35 points?
I don't know how many points there were in the game, but I feel like 35 is a decent guess.
It's higher. There were 47 total points in the game. Max Shepard played 42 of them.
Oh my gosh.
Absolutely insane. The only other points total played in a game that I can think of that exceeds that was Brett Matsuka back in 2015 in an overtime game against Pittsburgh as well. I think he played maybe 45 points in that game, but Brett Matsuka is made of nothing but sinew and like stamina. Like one of the greatest and weirdest, I feel like, or not weirdest, most idiosyncratic competitors that the sport has ever seen. But Shepard playing 42 points in a game is just absolutely absurd. But it was kind of in a little bit of the pre-modern era. So we'll see how he comes back and if he can come back from this legitimate hamstring injury as Pittsburgh looks to continue to push its playoff chances into July.
Yeah, I mean, seems silly to like highlight this game as like a big important one because we haven't done that for a Detroit game.
It's not so much important in the sense of the winner loss. It's like if Pittsburgh loses, it just opens up so much possibility for you guys in Indianapolis, for Chicago, even for Madison, for their potential of losing this game against Minnesota and having some padding in their standings.
Yeah, it for a Pittsburgh team that hasn't made the playoffs since 2019 and is looking to get back there, this would just be like kind of soul crushing. So, yeah. I'm just going to be most interested to find out when the game happens if Max Borowski ends up making his season debut alongside Andrew Gardner. So I guess that'll be something I'll look forward to finding out later.
Yeah, well, we'll be looking forward to all 13 games in the Week 9 slate. Again, Cam and Indy will be taking on Chicago on Saturday night, but there are a host of games available, all live on Watch UFA TV. There's the game of the week between Madison and Minnesota on Saturday night. There is also 6-0 Carolina at 5-2 Atlanta on Saturday night. We will be tuning in along with you to watch all of the action go down, but that will do it for this episode of Swing Pass. We will talk to you in just a couple of days to recap all the action and hopefully have a little bit clearer sense of what's actually happening with this playoff picture, because given the way that the season has gone so far, I completely expect to be talking about a few new storylines come the next time we're all speaking with you. Again, that'll do it for us here and now. Bye.